Damas y caballeros, señoras y señores, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure and honor to have our guest here today. I should inform you first that there's a particular type of format that I have never felt the necessity to make explicit in the No Free Dinner Either show of my YouTube channel, which is to approach someone and invite them to have an interview or a conversation with me who I believe is of greater stature than myself and with more meritorious experience, so as to then break a lot of the protocol rules of multimedia or audiovisual production and bring about tensions and moments of awkwardness that would otherwise seem inappropriate. But in this particular occasion, I instead would like to, first of all, for the sake of my stepson, say happy birthday to him. And it seems that there could be no better guest to have on this particular date, the date of the day before my stepson's birthday, than someone whose sermons and Sunday messages I have shared with my wife and stepson because of the great value that they communicate, the light that shines through them. Now, I should tell you one thing first, and that is that a Colombia man has been one of the most influential persons in my life. The American economist whose alma mater was Colombia and whose original degree was in mathematics, Murray Rothbard, the founder of the Libertarian anarchist movement. And so, without further ado, Mr. Cromwell, I welcome you and I ask you to please present yourself to our audience.
Thank you very much for your introduction. I feel very flattered that you have invited me into your program. I hope that we can have a productive discussion on everything. I'll give a very brief introduction because I don't like to be a pain about things. So my background is I was born and raised in the United States in the Northeast, although I live in Virginia currently, and I've always been a fan of the southern part of the United States for a variety of reasons. I started out really. I had no idea when I was in middle school that I was going to become a mathematician. But everything sort of, I actually started out as a mathematician because of my failure in math. That sort of had me inspired. And I had a very strict teacher who, when I was in the 7th grade and 8th grade, that really inspired me to do better about myself. So starting in high school, I really started getting into what is known as pure mathematics, right? What is known as the theory, not just the computation, but the why behind mathematics. And so I then went to Columbia University in the city of New York. I did my undergraduate degree there, which was back in the day. They didn't really have pure mathematics. They just called it math major. But they did distinguish between the School of Engineering, the Fu Foundation. So I was at Columbia College. And so I did my 4-year degree there, majored in pure mathematics, minored in, curiously enough, international relations, political science, just because I was always interested in that as well, the theory, political theory. And then I went to the University of London, specifically Imperial College, where I did a master's degree, and there they did have pure mathematics. After that, I started teaching in England, teaching as an assistant, really as an adjunct professor. Then I went to France, where I was there for several years. I ran an academy. Interestingly enough, the French didn't want me for math. They wanted me for English language. But I was able to make it work because the academy focused on English language teaching, but also with a focus on sciences and math. Then I lived in Madrid for several years, and that was actually my most enjoyable experience in Western Europe. I spent many years there, doing the same things as I did in France. Focus on English language learning, but also with a focus on math. Then in 2014, returned back to New York because I grew up in the New York area, not New York City specifically, but in the surrounding suburbs. Taught as an adjunct again. Then started out with city tutoring. And here we are in Lynchburg, Virginia, where I have my headquarters. But I also teach students from currently from around the world.
So it is herringbone and not seersucker. We have ourselves a Boston Brahmin and not a Chesapeake Bay gentleman. But I want to say, for the sake of psychological overcompensation, that my background is in the study of law. I studied for 3 years and I dropped out of law. And the date was 2001. It was a day of September. I was sitting down trying to solve some exercises with my tutor in mathematics. I had a string of tutors in mathematics throughout my life. I believe his name was Carlos Copper. And in the news, it came up that a plane had crashed into the towers in the United States, in New York City. So that is a memorable association in my mind to one of many tutors in mathematics that I had. Another one was when I was 26 years old. I went back, I had a job and I went for 3 months to a night academy and I prepared to take the math examination for my high school diploma. The equivalent in the educational system of Costa Rica would be something akin to what you would call the GED or general education diploma for someone who failed math in what you would call high school. And so after 8 years, I went back, I took the exam. I remember I was extremely fidgety and nervous. There were pens and pencils flying off, and I was the last person to leave the exam. And then I went to the academy where I took the leaflet. It was a format of an exam notebook, a leaflet, multiple question, and then an answers sheet that you would fill the dots and then would run through a machine. And we revised all the questions in the exam. And I came to conclude that I had failed by a very small margin. So I was very saddened by this. My stepfather, I was 26 years old. He had been with us since I was 10 years old. He was dying of cancer, and he nevertheless remained a smoker until the last day. And he walked with me into town to get his cigarettes and me to pick up the grade. And he told me, go pick it up anyway, because you don't know. You don't know. I said, I verified it. I'm sure I failed it. And he said, but go. And so I walked with him, and then our paths straight. He made a left turn, and then I kept on going to the Ministry of Education department of quality control, it's called. I picked up the exam and it said approved. So then I ran with my arms up in the air, and he, who was a Spaniard, looked at me and he said, in a gesture, I told you. So there have been many math tutors in my life who have given me a deep appreciation of perseverance and effective effort. I would summarize the spirit of what you try to impart in your videos with the words effective effort. Now, I should say that compared to you, I would be easily called some kind of narcissistic sociopath by the likes of Jordan Peterson or other people not familiar with the work of the late Thomas Sass. But you are a Christian, and I am very humbled by the firm conviction with which you talk about your faith. I would like to ask you a little bit about that and how it overlaps with a set of things relating to free will, political, financial, economic, and personal freedom. In your own experience, having related very deeply to your reading of the letter of James, because St. James, apostle, was the patron of Spain. Obviously, my forebears ultimately came from Spain. And so I would like to ask you, what is the connection between freedom, Christianity, and mathematics?
That is an excellent question, and it is not an easy one for a lot of people, and including for my own self, because it's often something that I've struggled with personally. So if we go back to my childhood years, right? A lot of people, they think, when they meet a Christian, they always think, oh, you are a Christian because you were raised that way or because that's all you know. That wasn't the case necessarily for me. Yes, I grew up nominally Christian. I grew up in my parents were believers, but they were not necessarily, I wouldn't say that they were rigorous in their faith. It all started for me when I was in the seventh grade. I was blessed, I guess, I attended a Christian school because back in the day, so in the U.S. you had three options really back in those days. You still kind of do. You have the public schools, but depending on where you live, the public schools have always been either they can be very good, but they're usually terrible for a variety of reasons. Or you can go to a Roman Catholic school, or you can go to a Christian Protestant school, which was in my area. It just happened to be my parents were nominally Anglican. So that means that they were not necessarily, they were not people who would read the Bible on a daily basis. But because they sent me to a local school where the founder was originally a Methodist, and he was from back in the day, his parents, well, he was an older gentleman, but his parents were from the 19th century. So they were they were originally from the South, actually, which is, I think that might have had an influence on when I first started being exposed to the Southern ways. And so the school was very oriented by the Christian faith, but also from a fundamentalist perspective. So that means you would go to church on Sundays, but you would also have to go to chapel on Fridays. So I grew up hearing the Bible. And they used to say, from reading from the Bible, they used to say, faith cometh by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. So that we had different speakers every Friday. You would either have some of your teachers preach to you, you would have either guests preach to you. That was in and of itself, they would teach you life lessons. So you would always learn, proper dress, proper speaking, everything had to have some kind of life application. And then in the classroom, because it was a Christian school, all the subjects had some kind of biblical reference, so that's when I first was exposed to actually reading the Bible on a daily basis, the King James Version, by the way. And so I would read, and we would have Bible class as well. And so I realized that everything had to have, no matter what philosophy you have, everything has a foundation in life. And a lot of people, they say, well, I'm an atheist, or I'm a humanist, or I'm this. And they say, I don't believe in God, or I believe Christianity is biased. But they don't realize that every single human being, if you are a thinker, you have to have a foundation of some kind. You have to have a starting point, a starting premise. And so after I was exposed to the Bible in those years, I started getting more curious personally. And so I went through a phase, I think most people do, even if you're a Christian, you go through a phase of doubt because you think that you're more advanced, or you think that you're more knowledgeable as a human being. And you say, well, this is nonsense. And, I know more than the Bible, or I know more than these old fashioned preachers and these outdated things. But then you realize that everything does have a foundation. And the Bible, they used to call it the book of books, right? And so everything can trace a source back to some kind of fundamental truth. And what I mentioned in a recent Sunday address about mathematics in its ideal form is really the language through which God inspired or whispered the universe into being. And I don't see it as a metaphor. I think numbers are not necessarily human inventions. They are human discoveries of truths that are already there. And they exist sort of outside of us. They're eternal, immutable, sort of like a moral law. And so I take I take it very seriously. That it's, some people would say Neoplatonic, I guess is the word, that the visible world is a shadow of intelligible realities. And so as a Christian, I believe that we were endowed by our Creator, not only with free will, but with responsibility. And we're not just leaves in the wind, we are moral agents, and faith shapes this sort of understanding. It roots our freedom in the soul, not only in the market or the ballot box, and certainly not, we have a culture now that is very self-indulgent. But it also teaches you that freedom has to be disciplined in many ways, right? So I think that if you look at the structure, math is a structure, it is a philosophy, and it is but a reflection of those fundamental truths that you see in the Bible. Now, I'm not saying that, if we're talking about rational numbers or the real numbers, I'm not saying that, automatically you're going to see a moral truth to that. But what I am saying is that everything has a structure that is a reflection of some kind of divine creation. And I think that is, you have to have a logical foundation for it.
And how does that influence your perspective on the political, juridical, and financial and personal and interpersonal implications of human freedom across the institutions of our world?
Because I think what has been lost if you go back to the history of education, let's say for the past, let's say 100 years or so, but slightly longer, but I'll use that as a reference. What has been lost is a lot of education after the Second World War, and you probably know the history about this, but after the Second World War, education, especially higher education and even high school, became sort of like, well, it's an application, right? How can I use this? What is the utility of this, right? But so it lost the old moral foundation that we used to have, which was education was it was not only there to teach you math, but or language, but it was also to teach you how to live right. And so I think what has happened is that if you look at back in the day, if you were a student at a university, especially in the US, but also broadly in the Western world, including, I think, the UK, Spain, France, you had to take a core number of classes. You had to take philosophy. Everyone had to take language. They used to call it logic and rhetoric. And so in a math class, even if you were not, there were no such thing as majors, right? There were no, well, in Spain, they used to call them, I remember, I know they changed it with the Bologna plan, but it used to be called careers, right? In the modern sense. But back in the day, there were no majors, right? So everybody used to have the trivium. It used to be called the trivium. And so students would often study law. You would be exposed to law, logic, rhetoric, philosophy, history, theology, and mathematics. And so I think that by pulling away from that, what we have now is over specialization. And students no longer have a clear vision of how to connect the dots, right? What is the connection between the moral foundation, the theological foundation, the rhetorical foundation? And what we have now is people who claim, and I've heard this in the US, I've heard this in Spain, people you probably heard the term, right? They say, I'm a humanities person. I'm not a science person. And that was, of course, if you go back 100 years, that was nonsense, right? Because you had to be well-rounded as a person. And I think in the case of your question, what I find is that as a mathematician, I like the balance of structure but also of liberty. And I know that freedom is untethered from if you separate freedom from truth, you don't have freedom, you have license. And the freedom to know, to love, to serve, all that is good. And I think now what we've confused is we're saying, okay, we're free, but what are you free from? And what are you free to do? And you have no moral foundation, you have no foundation of truth. So everything becomes sort of relative. And I think if you look back for the past 20 or 30 years, we've actually lost freedoms in the Western world. If you look back at what we were able to do 20, 30 years ago, even, you don't have to go back so far. We have lost a lot of our former constitutional freedoms. Even in the US, we're not a free society anymore. And so I think that you had asked me earlier about the judicial foundation of this. When you don't have a judicial system that is based on an overpowering truth, then anything goes, and that is what we have today, because we have an overregulated economy. We don't if even I'm not sure in Europe now, but they used to study the philosophy of law in the US, and that has been lost completely. We don't really study. If you ask a lawyer now, what is your philosophy of law? If they're under the age of 40, they'll look at you confused. They have no idea what that even means, unless there are exceptions, but it's very rare these days.
Are you married?
No.
Have you ever been divorced?
Nope. Always been single.
The issues that pertain to the potency of my ideological efforts have to do with the paradox of how do you prevent being framed, being portrayed as a kind of libertine when you are for liberty. And this is an unavoidable question for the libertarians, for the libertarian anarchists as myself, because to collapse the concept of the enforceable or justice in the legal sense only to defensive force necessarily leads us to a kind of description of bodies and their interactions that, in a very modern sense, very contemporary sense, excludes the concept of non-physical, non-mechanical truth. For a libertarian, justice is simply abstaining from invading the body or property of other persons. The issue is that while it is true that most of our interactions with persons on the street and in everyday life, as far as that is concerned, are guided by self-restraint, it is really a very small subset of the entirety of moral and ethical truths, of truths that inform our actions so that we can be guided to make the good and not evil choice that concerns this very reductionistic and mechanistic physicalist based aspect of life. And it is something that in many ways has led me closer to faith. I was raised as a Roman Catholic. I had a period in which I was influenced by the Quakers, and I was influenced by the Quakers because of the laxity from a Roman Catholic perspective. As I became a libertarian anarchist, I was drawn back to the scholastic, Thomistic, moral and natural law tradition. And in recent times, I've been more influenced by the works of Origin of Alexandria. But one of the things that I see in common with the decay of institutions that you describe is that if you are going to reduce interpersonal analysis only to either bodies or feelings, you're missing out intentions, motivations, ulterior motives, the possibility of collusion, hiding evidence, false testimony, all sorts of invisible but true potential actions that can have irreversible evil consequences. And this is not something that can be addressed without a language that is both metaphorical but meaningfully real to humans as they are forever. There's nothing new under the sun, says Ecclesiastes. But there is a human nature, and before Hume, before the idea of you cannot derive an should from an is, the idea was you need to understand the is. You need to understand that which is that is, being, being, being. You need to know what are the qualities, the essential characteristics of humans and of reality to be able to say, to be able to judge any given action. And so, what you talk about in terms of the decay from World War II in the United States is something that I see in all of our Western societies, and that is quite unescapable because everything has been reduced to either physical interactions or emotional psychologizing. And the gap that would unite the meaningful human experience of interacting with another person seems to have been lost. It seems like there is a disconnect between mathematics and ethics. And I heard once Jordan Peterson say something to the effect of a carpenter, referring to Joseph, that in a woodwork you can see an honest work. But this leads too much to a kind of structural thinking about effects. What will be the effects? What are the desired effects? This doesn't inform you into what should you desire.
Right.
I find, and I relate a lot to some of your Sunday messages. I find that in a sense, God is the mirror whose virtue shows my shame and guides me to the light of which I'm only a reflection. Are you familiar with the works of Christopher Langan?
Very so many years ago when I dedicated a lot more time to thoughts, to theory and philosophy, yes. Although it's been a while since I have not been exposed to it.
I think that there is a temptation to say everything has become hyper Aristotelian in our modern analysis. Bodies and deriving our observations from experience.
Yes.
But our observations from experience lead to understanding of our limitations that also make it clear that it is possible to have virtue, to have good action, and that this is not reducible to a particle. There's no good atom or good gene or good tissue beyond a structure, quality of durability, etc. There's no teleology of goodness. The gospel shows us the logic of goodness. For me, the idea of the Gospel of John, of the Word, the divine Word incarnate, and how it relates to the game theory of virtue is the perfect explanation of goodness that is not reducible to libertarian theory or any ideology. It's the idea of you should be good because goodness is the truth that sustains you.
Right.
Can you please try to give us your ethical perspective from a mathematical vision of Christianity? How, without the message and the teaching of Christ, it seems that it is impossible to coherently speak about goodness, virtues, rights, wrongs, good and evil.
Well, I think that you bring up a very good point, which is the in the past several decades, what we have you mentioned Aristotelianism, and what we have is this has been a result of as Christianity as an objective truth has been substituted by different philosophies. What we really have, and a lot of people don't realize this, but we really have paganism today. And so in different manifestations of paganism, of course, but it's all based on most pagan philosophies are based on sensory perception. They're based on you hear that now a lot. Instead of I think, I feel. Instead of I believe, I feel. At least in the English language, we hear that constantly now. Even when I was growing up, you never used to hear. The only time you would hear something like I feel was usually if you were personally sad about something, or if your hand burned, or if something physical. or of course in more subjective realms like personal love or things like that. But if we go back to the foundations of the scripture is about an absolute truth. It is also a rational truth, and this is what a lot of people don't realize today. Because if you start with logos, the Greek word logos, which is God describes himself as the logos, the word, and so you start with that objective foundation. You start with that objective truth that many people would perhaps find cold, although that's a silly word that people use these days. They say, "Oh, that's so cold," and really, what it is that what they don't like is the fundamental truth behind it. And so if you start from the logos, if you start from the fact that God is the foundation, and you believe that to be your original premise, your initial premise, then if that's the logos, then the word of God is truth. Because if God is truth, then his word must be true. And if you derive your framework, both your moral framework and also your educational framework and your thinking framework from that truth, then the mathematics makes sense, because then mathematics is nothing more than a manifestation in a different realm, of course, of an original truth. And every great, powerful thought in history of humanity has been under people who have been under the spell, and I don't mean spell like in a magical way, I mean under the influence, more precisely, of a great overpowering truth. You cannot accomplish anything, whether it be in education, whether it be in science, whether it be in mathematics, more precisely, without having a notion of a great fundamental truth. Even the ancients, because a lot of people, what they will say to this is they will go before the Christians and they'll say, wait a minute, but the ancient Greeks had mathematics, and so did there were some notions of mathematics in the ancient world. But the Bible already addresses that, because the Bible does talk about how even if someone is not necessarily a Christian, the truths of God are still there. And so they are but only manifesting those original divine truths of God. They may not express it in a Christian way, of course, and they didn't, certainly not the ancient Greeks, but it's the ancient Greeks would not have denied the existence of some kind of fundamental truth of some kind. And that is what I think is lacking today. What I think is lacking today is we have moved. It started in the 19th century in a very brutal way. The 19th century, we had Romanticism, right? And we had the period of irrationalism. And so I think that still has many profound influences today. The idea of Marxism. Marxism starts in the 19th century with Karl Marx.
And it is very reductionistic to materials.
Yes, and it's very much based on feelings. It's sensory perception. It's a lot of it. At best, what we can get today is deductive, right? But that is one of the reasons why math today is, in many ways, it's not taught properly. Because math, if you go back to the 1700s, 1800s, they used to be taught as axioms, right? Axiomatic truths. And even today, the best math books are considered to be the ones that start with axioms. You had, in the case of the US, you had Dolciani. That was just one of the famous ones. But even in my life, from a mathematical point of view, when I read Euclid's Elements, and
Euclid or Newton,
right,
or Russell.
Yes, and you see the purity of the logic there, the clarity of definition. You see proof everywhere, and it struck me as it's something more than intellectual. It also felt moral, because math was not just a tool. It was an encounter with the eternal. And so that's kind of what really motivates me, because the path takes you through the works of Kochi, you have Dedekind, you have Gödel, and each they reveal in their own way. You have glimpses of, it's really an unseen order. And, if you go back to Augustine, right? And he taught that numbers are part of the divine architecture of the creation. So there's a lot there in our history.
I should say that one of the things that I was very pleased by your Sunday messages was to find arguments that historically came from Augustine and Aquinas that you incorporate, either because of your mathematical training or because of your biblical knowledge in a way that it is not just a repetition of an argument, but an understanding and illustration of the argument. And the etymologies of words, the history which is contained within the etymology of words, is very radical when you talk about fundamentalist Christians. Fundament means the basis, and the reality of things. Latin, the word res, from which realitas comes from, refers to things. And the confusion, the disorientation that takes place in modernity seems to be to confuse physical material things with the truth of things. There is a split between the libertarian epistemology of the current movement, especially among anarcho-capitalists and objectivists, on the question of objectivism. But objective means that which is laid before you,
Right.
objectus. And it seems to me that I feel very inclined to say that the order of material things is being sustained by an order, an external order of immaterial things, such that our representations, mathematical and symbological representations of them, is actually just a reflection of the true, not real, true order that is maintaining the real physical order,
Right.
so that when we understand things that are not reducible to bodies or their interactions, we are seeing their interactions in a deeper, more, if not precise, more true manner. And this is interesting to me because the engineering types are very obsessed with a high definition, and also the legal types with a hyper precise semantic of words. But God is not so unsophisticated. For example, one of that the words would be so precise, or the terms would be so precise as to become mutually exclusive closed sets. When you say the eternal, obviously we Christians have the aspiration of the resurrection of the flesh, of New Jerusalem, of
Right.
the body. Christ resurrects. I have a friend whose name is Gerard Casey. He is a emeritus professor of philosophy in Ireland. He is a Catholic, and he says in the gospel we see Christ had his wounds, but he did not suffer from them, and he ate fish with the apostles.
Right.
So there is definitely a corporeal promise of the everlasting, but the everlasting refers to an order of things that are not only understandable as limited limits of physical surfaces that end in a discrete manner, and then something else begins. There's the idea of metaphorical interpretation of scripture, literal interpretation of scripture. I talk about the intentional interpretation of Christian scripture. God wants to save us. We cannot save ourselves by our own powers. Only a God can save us, would say Heidegger. The divine has communicated a truth that is of sufficient grace for us to be saved, because he wants us to understand the truth. But when I hear you talk about there is but one truth, this is not reducible to a physical thing. The idea of the overlap between ideas and reality includes the reality that is invisible. So I would like to ask you, when did you have a religious experience that related to the transcendental aspect of mathematics? How old are you? How old were you then?
I was really, so when I started getting interested in mathematics, even though it was in the seventh grade, I still at the seventh grade didn't really see necessarily a divine connection, right? I didn't see a moral absolute or a logical truth foundation. But by the time I was in high school, I really started getting into debates, and we had a debate club. at the high school, and I actually was exposed to libertarianism very early on. So I'm very familiar with Rothbard because we had some classmates. There was actually a libertarian club, believe it or not, in New York of all places, but which is one of the least libertarian places in the world. But we did have, so I was exposed to Murray Rothbard, but really the book that really had a profound influence on me, believe it or not, aside from the Bible, in a more secular perspective, was, so I had traveled with the debate club to Virginia, and I was only 17 years old. And there was I had to stay at one of the local colleges right here in Lynchburg. And they had something called back in the day college for a weekend, where you sort of be exposed to the universities and see. And I was blessed by God because the person I stayed with, I'll never forget him. His name was Nathan Cooper. I'll never forget him. And he asked me a little bit. We had to stay with one of the actual students who were already at the college, and he gave me a book. He said, "You know what?" He said, "What do you want to major in?" I said, "Well, I'm thinking of mathematics and also political philosophy." So he said, "Oh, you know what?" He said he was a pre-law major, and so he gave me a famous book. You probably know it, Frederick Bastiat, The Law.
Yeah.
And it's a short book. And he gave me the new copies. I said, "Are you sure you want?" He said, "No, please." He said, "I've already read it. You can keep it. It's for you. It's a gift. Please accept the gift." So I did. And so I started reading chapter 1, and everything from there, everything that he was saying, I was saying, I can't believe that this man lived hundreds of years ago, and he's describing America today. The lack of respect for property, the taxation, the plunder. He used the word specifically, plunder. Um, and so I was 17 at the time, and I started connecting those truths to the Bible, right? Because I already was starting to form a worldview. Um, I was saved, properly saved, like when I really repented and accepted Christ. I was actually 17. It was that year, which was my junior year of high school. And so I started to see that all truth is God's truth. And that includes, of course, mathematics. So I started with a project to restore the idea that God's law is the foundation for a just and orderly society. So there's a very clear, I actually think there's actually a clear philosophical harmony between that and, even though he wasn't a Christian, but Euclid, going back a little bit earlier, of course. And so because the elements, begins with axioms, you begin with self-evident truths, and from there you construct an entire logical system. And that's kind of mirrors what I'm arguing about God's law, that it is the fixed, non-negotiable starting point from which moral reasoning and civil order has to flow, because there's no such thing as neutrality. No one is neutral, including people who say, nowadays we hear, oh, the law has to be neutral. There is no neutral law. It's an illogical, it's a logical inconsistency, because law is a reflection of a value system of some kind. So without
I,
that foundation, everything collapses into some sort of relativism.
I should say one thing here, which is that for reasons of marketing and insincere rhetoric, many times in the recent past, I have engaged in the promotion of this very reducible vocabulary of the enforceable. When is it justified? When is it available or acceptable to use force against the body of a person against their will?
Mhm.
Like the person who attacks you obviously intends to
Right.
attack you, and obviously intends to continue with this attack regardless of your will. And then when you exercise legitimate defense and you impose your will against this, you are using force against his will. But this still is referring a lot to physical interactions. I should say one thing regarding your most recent statements, and that is, if there is a moral foundation to the ethics of force, it doesn't stop there. If there is a mathematical foundation to the mechanics of materials, it doesn't stop there. And when you talk about Euclid, the Greek mathematician that is the introduction to geometry, is talking about the essential persistent qualities of shapes. A triangle has three sides. A square cannot be a circle by definition. And it is very easy in the modern days with the obscurantism of materialist thinking to reduce the essence of things to something completely amoral or without ethics. And that's how you end up with situations in which the very quaint and friendly and I would say fully acceptable cheap one-liners of Sebastian's uh, philosophy, such as there's always the opportunity to do the right thing, there's always the opportunity for improvement, because God is infinite goodness and we are finite beings. That means that there is a possibility for accumulative improvement as we try to approach the good, the better thing. Better is always superior. There's always a temptation to say the materials, the biological organic components that constitute this person determine that his limits are such that he will forever be a Negro or a Jew
Mhm.
and not a German or a good person.
Right.
And this kind of obscurantism is dangerous not only in retrospective, it is dangerous in its potential. It's reducing personality not to those arrows that may miss the mark of our actions. What is the mark that our actions should pursue? But to a clarity of conviction that most of my experience in life, because I tend to have certain advantages in speech, has been people become very suspicious of me. People become very, very, very suspicious of me. That's why I said, if you are not familiar with the works of Thomas Sass argues that for disease to be real, it has to be organic disease. But he rejects the concept of mental illness. Mental illness is a way for murderers to be excused because of the insanity defense, or people who have not harmed or violated the criminal law to be incarcerated. But one of the things that people don't say, the proponents of the concept of mental illness, is mental illness being congruent and equivalent to the concept of error, where your views are just morally, ethically, or really wrong. They don't call that craziness in the common sense, in the things you should pursue, survival. I am the truth, the life, and the way. And so I want to ask you, when you do mathematics, do you ever have an experience that beyond making an income, teaching students, there is an ethical choice that you are acting out in the real world that has the potential to go towards evil or towards goodness? I see your insistence on the abstraction of proof in pure mathematics rather than the application of engineering, finance, and computer science. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Thank you for that question. So I believe as a Christian that human beings are naturally depraved, right? We are
Yeah.
all depraved individuals with a capacity to do a lot of evil, right? Even within one of the differences is that when you are saved by the grace of God, you are you're supposed to become, you do become a new creature in Christ. However, your old sinful nature, your old habits, some of them will remain with you. You struggle with them. But now what helps is that because you have a moral foundation, because you have a Christian foundation that can struggle against, for example, the word carnal, right? In Spanish, carne, right? It means of the flesh, right? And so all human beings in different ways, of course, struggle with what they used to call sins against the flesh. And so I do think that even within the perfection of mathematics, because it is a perfect system, once you have proofs, you still, as a human being, because we are fallen creatures, we still have the capacity to do evil, even within a perfect system. We see that also within the Christian framework, right? There are men who, although they may be saved, they might go through a period of darkness. And so they used, there have been cases of pastors, for example, who misuse their authority in the church to do bad things. And then oftentimes you get them to be, many of them repent, which is a good thing, and others, they start justifying some of their bad habits or their bad behavior in the church. But you also brought up a very fascinating point, I think, and it is the idea of mental. Nowadays we are living in a society where of fantasy, because we no longer have a framework of truth, and because anything goes. That's why you have some of the situations you have today where people say, well, I can be of any gender I want, and I've invented a new identity. And not only have I invented a new identity, but now you as an individual are forced to accept my invented reality, even if it's grounded in nothing except my own personal feelings. And that's an extreme example, but you also see it in when I used to live in England. I remember, I don't know if you've been to London, but Speaker's Corner. So
Yes.
there were always people there. And I remember speaking to a lot of different people there, because I used to often go, I love debate. So as you could probably tell. So I would go there and I would have people say the most absurd things, like, for example, I am a citizen of the world. Really? What country is that? I've never heard of a country called the world. You are a citizen, whether you want it or not. You are a citizen you can be a citizen of a country or some countries, but you're still under the jurisdiction of some kind of authority. And so they would say things, really absurd things, or people would say, I feel, I spoke to an Italian one time there. He was living in England. I said, why are you in England? I was curious. And he said, oh, it's because I feel at home in England. And I said, what does that mean? What does it mean to feel at home? That means nothing to me. I said, are you of English origin? And he said, no. He said, but I feel like the English. I said, that's not my question. I asked you, what is your purpose to be in England? Because if you ask me, I told you, well, because I have an academy there. I run things. But I think, going back to the math, I do think that there is a capacity you can use any philosophy you have. You can use it for good or evil. And so I think the important thing in math is just like with any other philosophy, you still have to be trained and grounded within the truths of God, the moral law of God. If you don't have that foundation, then you can't. I mean, math has been used for evil in the past. We had, a lot of regimes have used science, for example. Well, science is not math, but a lot of the sciences uses math as a tool, but they've used it for evil because those regimes have not had a Christian foundation. We've had things like eugenics, for example, which I personally think it's evil. It's evil in the sense that because when government uses it in that way, it has the potential to be very evil, as we've seen in history. So absolutely, I do think that.
I think that what you mentioned brings me back to the historical, unavoidable reality of the life of John von Neumann, von Neumann, or even Einstein, in that they definitely had insights on the nature of nuclear matter. My father founded the Department of Nuclear Medicine in San Jose. He died when I was 9. But if you think about the actual political and belligerent effects that their insights had on the population of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, largely civilians, in the context of nuclear warfare, the application or the dispersal of nuclear energy, later with the use of uranium weapons, depleted uranium, U-238, there is a complete loss of a moral compass here. It almost begs the question of whether it would not have been better to postpone the publication and the application of these insights so that that would not have happened. And it is so. Rothbard would say that people tend to specialize in the things that they are really bad at, and this would make sense for the fallacy of psychologizing, that there's some overcompensatory mechanism at hand. But what is striking about this misapplication of science, as you mentioned, eugenics, or of mechanical insights, mechanisms used for evil ends, is that, allow me a digression. I married my wife in the year 2022. We recently had our anniversary. I came here. I abused the system of international law and human rights law by virtue of this takes me into another digression. Please bear with me. Just open brackets and then open square brackets. But the fact of the matter is that my wife, on her paternal side, comes from the region of Spain that my mother's first ancestor to arrive to Costa Rica came from, which is the region of Asturias. There's a saying in Asturias that Asturias is Spain, the rest is conquered land, because from Asturias the reconquest was waged. Of course, these things in this particular area of Europe where I find myself now in the Netherlands is very politically incorrect and personally dangerous. There are some personal risks associated to speaking plainly. But the fact of the matter is that we in Spain had the Reconquista, the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula and Portugal. And as you mentioned in one of your videos, by the grace of God and providence, there was bad English weather the day the Spanish Armada tried to conquer another Christian realm.
Right.
Now, of course, Jefferson's library contained the works of Juan de Mariana, who became famous by saying that there is ample reason for tyrannicide if the king, goes against not only justice, but morality.
Right.
And of course, feudalism did not take place in Spain as it took place in most of Europe. There were small hidalgos and landowners. And this was related to the nearly 1,000 years of reconquest, which definitely must have had some cultural influence on the Second Amendment and the rights of Englishmen to bear arms and so on. But I married my wife during a time in which you could not travel freely across nations, even as a Christian, from a Christian nation to another Christian nation, historically.
Right.
Without papers to the effect that you have had some medical procedure. But I had studied law, and I knew that, of course, there were exceptions for family, and I wanted to see my future wife. And so I sent my lawyer, who had everything according to legislation. He got the deed, and then I was able to travel here and unite with her. And then when they said, well, you didn't apply from your own country of Costa Rica, and I said, I went to the embassy. They said it was closed because of the flu measures, and they wouldn't reply to our emails. Then I said, well, my stepson is a citizen of this landmass, the European Union, and he has right to a normal, continuous daily life, a family. And you would disrupt that if you would break things apart by telling me to go back and file some procedural, logistical checklist. And I've been since here awaiting trial on my appeal, but without the right to work, which for a libertarian anarchist who believes in free markets makes things quite extreme in terms of trying to get an income. At times I have interviewed persons for cryptocurrency in order to wage an income for my family. And in the midst of all that, I translated a book by my friend from Belgium, who is a retired professor, anarcho-capitalist, Frank van Doen. Frank van Doen wrote The Fundamental Principle of Law, and he's quite a Neoplatonist. Now, going back to Rothbard, close parenthesis. Rothbard said that people tend to overemphasize or specialize in that which they're bad at. I would actually argue that the beauty of the Rothbardian movement is that by referring to transcendental ethics, to interpersonal ethics of force, and by being an Aristotelian epistemologically, he begs so many Neoplatonic questions about goodness that you're inevitably brought back to a position more akin to the book, The Fundamental Principle of Law, which I translated informally by my friend Frank van Noon, who is also a libertarian anarchist, which acknowledges that goodness cannot be, even in the algebra of libertarian invasions of bodies and self-defense and threats thereof, cannot be reduced or confined to a set that excludes all sorts of situations in life that Christianity informs us we would be in the wrong if we did, that have nothing to do with irreversible physical destruction, that have nothing to do with invasion of private property, which have nothing to do with stealing or attacking, but that would objectively, truthfully, be the wrong thing to do. And this is a thing that is not unimportant if you consider the fact that, as I said, here in Northwestern Europe and the Netherlands, to talk about a certain false peace, a certain submission, a certain enforcement, submission, false peace, a pax romana, without using euphemisms that are there to mask the fact that we have reached the borders of Christendom. It's very easy to talk about mass migration or illegal aliens. It is not easy to talk about the false peace of submission when you know it lives next to you and you may be beheaded due to it. And so I want to ask you about your experiences in Europe. I I lived in London in 2014 and again in 2019, 2020, and you were in Madrid, where obviously for my listeners, there's a great school that refers to the old scholastic schools of Salamanca and Austrian economics by Professor Jesus Huerta Soto. I would like you, as an American, to tell our audience about the frustrations that you felt as a person from the Americas, as a Christian person from the Americas, in the European continent, in the diverse lands that you were in, France, England, and Spain.
That's an excellent question because it's often something that has had a profound effect on me, even today. Because people often ask me, they say, "Why are you so anti-European?" And I'm not actually. I'm very pro-European. I'm what I'm really against is like you were saying, the usurpation of the true glory of what Christendom used to be about. So it's not that I'm anti-European, it's that European Union to me has nothing to do with Europe in reality. It is the least European thing that you can have. But yes, I did have a lot of, I did notice in Europe in general, and this is of course a general observation, there was a paralysis, a reluctance to sort of get things done in a proper way. And I know that has to do, it's a mix of history, but I think it's also one of the reasons for that is socialism. Because socialism on the European continent, and including the United Kingdom, has had a much stronger protagonism than it has had here in the US for a variety of historical reasons. And one of the things that always struck me in Europe is that I started noticing this in Madrid, actually, but also in Paris. But since I lived in Madrid starting in the mid 2000s, I would hear comments back in those days, like when someone used to commit, let's say, even petty crime, right? The most typical reaction used to be a sort of like a fake humanism, sort of like, "Oh, poor thing," or "You should, oh, you don't want to go back to the old criminal code, do you?" They sort of gaslight you in different ways. But then what really had, then I knew everything was done for was, so I was in Madrid during the attacks of 11th of March, 2004. Well, I wasn't in Madrid, the city. I was in the Escorial area because I had a beautiful, I was living very close to the monastery, actually, which I loved. And so I'll never forget my experience there. But then I remembered people's reactions. The moment, I don't know if you were following it at the time, but the moment that that attack happened, the government of Spain at the time was the Aznar government, which was sort of conservative, but it was, it was sort of took a hard line against terrorism. And all of a sudden, people voted in the socialists. So for me, as an American, my reaction at the time was, well, they actually gave the terrorists what they wanted. They did not, the people there, and I'm not saying all the Spanish people, but at least in the general ethos, the general zeitgeist, if I may use the term, was that perhaps the terrorists were right about certain things, because then they said, oh, we should not have intervened in Iraq. Why should we have gone? So they were following the same line. You see that today also, by the way, in many other ways. So I felt that there was a mix of paralysis. I felt that there was a reluctance to, like you were saying, to speak strongly about certain things that here in America we take for granted. A lot of Americans don't understand this because they say, oh, of course, we're not as free as we were 20, 30 years ago. But even compared to Europe, I can say things here that would probably get me, if not arrested, at least in big trouble in most European countries, including, I think, Spain. Because they could find a law that says, you're inciting, whether it be religious hatred, or they have all these laws that they call, incitement to hatred. UK has that too. Of course, it only applies to certain people because other people can say what they want. You know what I'm talking about. And so I think you reminded me also what you were mentioning earlier about sort of people who invent identities and things like that, because I always used to tell people, whether you want to or not, you're born in the nucleus of a family, and who you are, whether you want to believe it or not, you are influenced also by your past, who your ancestors were, right? That is there. You could be born, for example, in your case, you could be from Costa Rica, but through your heritage, right? You have the blood of people who fought against certain things that is in you. You have a profound cultural influence, and it's the same thing here in America. We were sort of our main cultural influences on the East Coast, especially, have to do with the Anglo-Celtic Germanic culture. That's why an American, when they go to Holland, for example, or Germany, or even the UK, yes, of course there are differences, but by and large, you can understand more or less. You can get by very well. And so I think people try to escape those things, and you can't. Actually, when I was in Spain, you might have heard of him. I happened to read the works of a famous Carlist. You've heard of the Carlist Wars. So his name was Vasquez. Well, in Spanish, it was Vasquez de Mella. And he was a famous writer, and I loved, because I was able to I like reading old things. And so the rich language, and he spoke about that too. He said he was speaking from a Roman Catholic Carlist perspective. He said, you do not escape what God created you to be. You may think that you want to be an industrialist, he said, or you want to be in the city, but at the end of the day, you were born in a family. You come from somewhere, and you were born within a class. Now, that doesn't mean you cannot escape your class. That doesn't mean you cannot improve who you are. But at the end of the day, you are influenced by who your parents were. And people don't like to hear that these days. So I think as an American in Europe, what frustrated me the most was two things. One was the reluctance to get certain things done. And number two, the pervasiveness of the socialist mentality. Even the conservatives in Europe, they do have a profoundly statist vision of, in Spain, you have the Partido Popular. And they are, I consider them to be just like Democrats in the U.S. For the most part. Now, you do hear a few others. You do hear nowadays they have. I have been following a few things. Vox, you have now, but again, they all share the same vision of the state has to do more, and so I think that is profoundly has affected people in Europe, and so. I don't think Europe today, like nowadays, I like something you said. You talked about people talk about the mass illegal migration, but of course you have mass illegal migration because you the European Union as a whole, the Europeans in general, you don't have a response to that because you don't have a proper Christian ethos to properly respond to that. So of course, Islam, for example, is taking over, not because Muslim people are, putting on paper that they want to do this, but because there is a gap, there is a void. If people are not spiritual, God is going to say, well, you fall under judgment.
I want to touch on that because when you talked about the general zeitgeist, I was reminded of Voltaire saying that that the moment where we say that 2 + 2 makes 5, we're in big trouble.
Right.
Especially if it's down to if it's left to democratic majorities determining truths. And of
Right.
course, that is the idea of the general will of the French revolutionaries
Yes.
and Rousseau. Now, of course, the reaction was, especially from the left, that after the attacks in Madrid, funny that you should mention attacks in the homeland of all of us who speak Spanish, I began this interview by referring to the attacks that took place in 2001 in the United States, both terrorist attacks. But yes, the left hijacked that moment to say, see, this happened because of the Aznar government's support
Right.
for George W. Bush.
Right.
And yes, about Vasquez de Mella, I am reminded of my grandfather. Some of his books that I got a hold of were by Vasquez de Mella. But there's something about class and determinism that in England you saw it manifest itself as a sense of resentment or as a sense of overcompensatory psychological mechanics. Some people in England that I met always had to seem as though they were teaching whoever they were speaking to. It would be impossible for them to accept in their position that they could learn something from another person. And of course, I don't know what you know, you don't know what I know. Only in exchanging with each other do we see the topology of the two sets and where they overlap and how they relate to the set of reality, what ideas that we both contain are true and correspond with reality. But it seems that socialism in England appeals a lot to this resentment towards the old caste. And I use the word caste because in castes there's no social mobility. In castes there's this same. It's even worse because if you said I'll never be blonde and blue-eyed because of the materials and genes that I'm composed of, is different as saying I'll never be a king or a duke or an aristocrat
Right.
because of the grace that I lack from God in not manifesting itself in history that way. And this leads to a class society where there's a kind of lockdown of perpetual warfare. But the perpetual warfare is not like the Reconquest of Spain, where you have firm convictions. I am less of a perfectionist than you are, obviously being more verbal abstract and you being more numeric. But I am 100% with you on the view that you should have convictions that surpass your desire to live, and that these convictions should be based on truth. I mean, in the current world, you have to make extremely strange and bizarre appeals. I remember a thinker in an interview who has been familiar with libertarian ideas, retired psychiatrist Theodore Dalrymple, who I had the honor of meeting. And he said, incest, I believe, will be the next big thing because two consenting adults.
Right.
No reproductive effect because of condoms or contraceptives. What is wrong about that? And this is something that is not reducible to mechanical interactions of bodies, but that in our soul, we understand is not about higher statistical possibilities of Down syndrome, autism, and so on. So I would like you to comment again on England, because you spoke a little bit about Spain. What shocked you most about England? But since you talked about escaping, you told me that you had your vision of Bastiat at 17.
Yes.
You escaped the question, however unintentionally, of how old you are.
I am 44. But
What shocked you most about England as an American, as a Christian, and
it's
as a freedom-loving person?
it's a good question. So here in America, we have most people, if you talk to them about England, they have a very idealized vision of England, right? They think because many of us have English ancestry. And so you usually think of the motherland, right? And it is in many ways, in many ways. You know, you could go to England, and at least like the Northeast where I grew up, I felt in many parts of England very similar. You know, you see the architecture. Of course, theirs is older, much older, right? We're a young country in the U.S., but you still see that connection, right? And in some places, you know, speaking of the weather, I mean, the Northeast here is horrible, the weather. So that was not that was actually very similar to me. The gray skies, the sort of the cold, and also in the Northeast of the U.S., we tend to have unfortunately a negative, almost cynical outlook towards life. And so I think that was, in my case, that made things in England quite easy because I felt very similar in many ways. We have the same outlook on things. We had sometimes the same sarcastic humor as well, the sense of irony. You know, Betty Davis was originally from Massachusetts, and she used to comment on that as well. She said, I always knew, she said, you know, in England, I always felt like just another person. However, for me, there are those similarities, but it ends there, you see, because what I noticed the most about the English in particular, and I don't say British because because you know the English are very particular compared to the Irish or the Scottish or the Welsh. There is a sense of it's not just that it's a negative culture, right? But there are certain things that you were saying that is true that you cannot, and honest English people will tell you this. America, still on paper at least, if you take very bold risks here, you can actually get a lot here. You can actually still do a lot. Yes, there are risks, and yes, you know, you could be, for example, we don't have the same idea of job security that the Europeans have, including the British. We don't have the same idea of paid holidays. But you can actually, if you organize your life well in the US and you're smart about the decisions you make, you can actually make a very good living for yourself. Quality of life is relative, of course. That depends on how you are as an individual. That depends on the things you value. But what I did notice that I did not like about England was there is a sense of limitation on things, right? That you will always reach some kind of ceiling, and that applies to the English people as well. It's much more difficult for the average English person to come out of that sort of negative rut that many of them live in. They conform themselves with a lot less than we do here in America, right? What things that here would be completely unacceptable, which makes our life more expensive, by the way. But we have that sense of, you know, I'm not going to spend $400,000 on a house that is sharing a wall with a neighbor. It's just not going to happen. If I'm going to spend 400,000, 500,000, I want a proper house. The English will conform themselves. They'll actually think that, you know, 400,000 pounds for a shared wall, that's a bargain. And then, you know, they conform themselves to they have their outlook on life. And again, I'm generalizing, of course, but there are some truths to that, to the generalization, right? So, you know, they always say stereotypes are there for a reason, even though it doesn't apply to every single person. But they do tend to conform themselves with a lot less. And then what I noticed was similar to what you were saying. They have this idea that because they are the motherland in many ways of the US, that they will not take lessons from an American. They simply will not. And they will say something like, well, you know, when you were, you know, swinging from a tree, we were actually building your civilization. And that is, there is a lot of truth to that. However, I think that starting in the 19th century, towards the end of the British, towards the decline of the British Empire, they stayed behind. And they haven't really fully recovered since. So if you add to that the negativity, the weather, it's just difficult in general to do things. And so that I think had a profound effect on me, that I said, this is not what a lot of Americans have this idea of England, that is like Downton Abbey. And it's really not like that at all. You do meet people, of course, you meet, there's also a very rigid class system, of course. So, but most people, if you go to a pub there or a cafe, most people there are struggling quite a lot more, I would say, than Americans. The only difference is that over there, some gaps that here in the US we don't fill in, like the healthcare, because for them that's very important. Not that it is here as much, although a lot of Americans would like to have socialism, especially these days. But I think that that's one of the things that struck me the most. They're not, to put it all in one phrase, right? Americans are a lot more positive about the English than the English are about Americans, if that makes sense. And that has an effect on how people perceive you and treat you.
The cosmopolitanism of Christianity, the idea of I am not the material characteristic that makes my hair black and my skin brown, but a person of equal dignity in the treasure of salvation and redemption through Christ, that would make sense as a form of universalism, like in the Middle Ages, the concept of Christendom, geographical, political context of the time, is shockingly lost. And the reason why I asked the question about England is because after living for 3 years here in the Netherlands, I realized, much to my chagrin and shock, that, speaking of derogative terms, I have, in recent times, due to the decadence of institutions, Boston Brahmins and Virginia gentlemen, taken to calling them United Statists. I realized that your civilization, has more in common with us culturally in the general worldview of practicality, of getting things done, than we have with Spain or you have with England. Once you get to the Netherlands, it's another world, and it's very strange because it is a rich, developed world like England or the United States, materially, physically, machines, logistics, infrastructure. But the attitude, the mental approach to entrepreneurship, to problem solving, is fully absent. And you said that wealth, prosperity, standard of living is relative. I tend to be a very lax Christian, a bad Christian, a bad Catholic, bad Christian, bad Christian, because I want to make things easy for me. I want to not preach anything that I cannot practice. So I cherry pick, I go to the golden rule, I go to the two great commandments, and I say, where there's a contradiction or apparent contradiction in Scripture, it's solved by the words of Christ and especially the two great commandments. But this is, I must admit, out of practical necessity. It's beyond the possibility of my imagination to live up to the law. I hope that the love will be forgiving on my backsliding and slips and errors and stubbornness. But I want to ask you, because I see you nodding, and I notice that there's a degree of agreement in terms of Latin Americans, Hispanics, if you will, and Americans, who in many ways cooperate in division of labor, commerce, etc., having more in common with each other than with more 19th century socialist influence Europeans. What was the final straw? What led you back to America after you had obviously some success in Europe?
I think you bring up a very good point. Actually, Thomas Jefferson spoke about, and Alexander Hamilton, as early as the 1700s, spoke about the greater Americas, because even back then they noticed that there was a great distance between England in particular, but also just the European continent in general, specifically with the Americas. And Hamilton, Jefferson, their vision, their dream really was a sort of a greater America where you would commerce freely. And they mentioned that because we are composed of new populations and or people who decided they were from Europe, but also people who were riskier. We have more risky behaviors, and I think that's true. I think it's applicable to both North America and Latin America, South America, Central America. We share certain things. A certain bold, like sort of risk-taking behavior that I think is absent completely in the European system. So in that sense, we have, if you think about the US specifically, we have Canada to the north, we have Mexico to the south. None of those countries are our enemies. We disagree. Usually our disagreements stem from things like either commercial or immigration, right? But we know for a fact Mexico is not going to send in an army and put bombs in our trains, and of course, certainly not the Canadians. We know Latin Americans in general are not going to do that. So I think that we have that advantage. I think that's why the U.S. is still, despite all the problems we have, it is still the not only the reserve currency, but people feel safe putting their capital here. And so in my case, when I was in Europe, what really motivated me was, ironically, it was actually the Europeans themselves. Because one of the most common questions that I got when I was living there is, why are you here? And because they're in their reasoning, right? People who were well traveled, they would ask me. I remember in Spain, I was in Valencia, beautiful city, but I love, one of my favorites in Spain, because I love having a body of water near me. And so a lady there, she was running an academy there. She was originally from France, and she was only in Spain because her daughter had married a Spaniard. And she asked me, she said, if I were you, coming from, the northeast of the US and, having your profile in general, I would not spend my days in any European country. And I heard it more than once, because if you said, you only heard it from one, senile lady or whatever, but I heard it often from people. I would hear it from young people. I would hear it from business owners in Spain and France. People say, why are you here? And they would understand after I would explain to them, well, I'm doing okay for myself. I didn't live poorly. I lived very well. But it did strike me after a while. I said, that there is a limit here. There is a limit in what you can do. I was in Spain, and when I decided to come back to the US, and I said, I was doing okay, but I noticed everything. The English language academies also, they're about to bust right now, because the demand has dropped quite a bit. And so I figured, I was thinking to myself, this was right after, this started around 2008, the financial crisis, although I did very well, even despite that. But around 2014, I said, you know what? It's true. There is a paralysis here. People are great. It is true. The lifestyle is very nice in some ways, at least for me. I like the walkability. I like the relaxed culture of it. But there is a limit. And if you are the type of person, if you are an independent person where you like to have your own business, you like to do things a certain way, your way, it's not really compatible with any of the European mindset, because the European mindset is there is a process to do things that is run by the state. It's not well seen. You probably know this, right? For example, in Spain and France, it's not well seen to be a job hopper, right? You don't go, if you open up a business and you fail, that is actually a very dark mark against you. Whereas here, you could tell the average American that you've opened up 10 corporations and they've all failed, and people actually admire the fact that you've tried. They might criticize you if you become a political candidate, right? But that's only because of politics. So that really was what motivated me to come back. And also, this might sound very strange, but you could never, and you might agree with this as well. in Europe in general, you could never have, outside the big cities in the US, some of the land you can get here in the US, the beautiful sort of, I live on a plantation. You could never, I mean, even if you wanted to, it's very hard to find unequipped, because Europe is congested in a way that the urban planning there. I lived very well in Madrid. I lived in the Salamanca district, so it wasn't bad, but it's not. It's you're still in a densely populated area. That has some advantages, but after a while, after you become a certain age, you also want to have some kind of land, some kind of green around you. So it was a mix of things. And then, of course, there's a third reason, a more personal reason, and it's because my parents, of course, are here and they were aging. And so I said, I wanted to be close to them in the aging process, even though because they live in the Northeast. But I'm still close enough that I can go, if anything happens and take care. I feel a duty to them in that sense.
I should show you something, but since you mentioned lineages and parenthood and the conjunction of man and woman in each other's arms, and if you do not come too close, let us do not ask what is it, let us go and make our visit. You mentioned the Northeast, T.S. Eliot, the Boston Brahmin, New England, the Green Mountain of Vermont. Why is your hair so suspiciously dark? Let me reduce you to categories and ask you, what are you?
That's a good question. So, as far as I know, if you go back to the 18th century, mostly British, like British Isles. So Welsh, I know Welsh, English, and northern, the area of Scotch Irish as well. So that's as far as I know. I might have some French as well, but that's as far as I can go back at least to the 1700s in terms of that.
Where did your parents come from, and which state of the United States?
So my mother was originally from Louisiana, actually, and then my father from New York State.
That is interesting. Former friend of mine, Stefan Kinsella, jurist from the United States, he was from Louisiana. He's of some Cajun extraction. He made a very interesting argument as a libertarian, as an anarchist, etc., that he found intellectual property as a negative servitude, that if you have a recipe for blueberry pie and I emulate the recipe, your recipe, you discovered it. Let's talk in Neoplatonic terms. You discovered this combinatoric combination of elements of materials, ingredients, and you put it out for sale. And then I take it, go to a chemist, I reverse engineer the recipe, and then I take my own eggs, my own milk, my own flour, and I emulate it and compete against you in the market. His position is that for you to claim a patent or intellectual right on that recipe is just a negative servitude, is me being limited by force of what I can do with my flour, my eggs, my blueberries, because the money of the consumer does not become yours or mine before the transaction, before they give up their own money and give it. And so the metaphor of stealing customers is a stretch. You said you like to argue. Please give me your view.
So I think when you have, you always have to be aware of who your target market is, right? Because if you, depending on the products you have and depending on the type of, you always have to be aware of what your possibilities are, but also your limitations, right? So you can take that same pie, and if you market it to the wrong kind of people, it will not have any success. But the contrary to that is you can also do something, have a very mediocre product. And if you target it in a smart way to the right kind of people, they'll spend whatever money they have on it. And we often see that actually there's more of that than the former. Because if you see people today, you could market the most mediocre things to them, and people will actually spend a lot of money for it. One example of that is in food, right? You see that.
So are you saying that the materials themselves, or even the configuration of these materials into a particular specific shape or form, an alloy, etc., is not what begets the satisfaction of consumer demand, but the understanding of what it is that the consumer is asking from you, what they need?
Yes, it's because it's I'm not saying their perception is right, but their perception is what's going to influence how much they spend on it. We have that now. For example, you can have the best car that is old, but people they'd rather spend hundreds of dollars a month on a new car at least in the US. I know it's different here, but every 2 or 3 years, people will buy this SUV. And it's really, they call it an upgrade, right? And it's really not, I mean, the only difference might be that, nowadays the upgrade might be you have a good stereo, perhaps, or a better GPS system, perhaps. But if you think about it, right, the majority of people are using their car to go to and from work. They're not really using it for long distance trips or things that would really require some of the more using some of the more sophisticated applications in their car, right? But yet they still want to have it. They still say, oh, I want to have this. They perceive themselves as it gives them some sort of status in some way. And so they're willing to spend a lot of money. Most Americans are willing to spend hundreds of dollars a month. Oftentimes their entire, between that and their rent or mortgage, they're spending all their income on these things. So I don't think people look for necessarily the quality of the ingredients or the makeup of the ingredients. It's more how they will perceive. It's a mix between how they feel they will be perceived, but also how they themselves perceive the product.
As I said, I like to wiggle my way to being able to practice something, to then nag, guilt, and manipulate everybody to join me in practicing that something. Not because I want to practice the entirety of the ethical and moral law, but because I want to feel a sensation of effective persuasion over others. Aside from relative cycles of demand and supply and aspirations, in the same manner that I have tried to embody why you should not become a lawyer, a judge, why you should learn law and the language, the vocabulary of law to argue against injustice. My question to you would be, aside from how many licensed engineers there are in the guild anywhere right now, but more across time and space and the generations of history, how and why would you persuade young people? I'm 39 years old, or let me call myself 39 years young, to engage in the study of mathematics, pure mathematics, and not engineering, not computer science, and not financial mathematics.
Because only mathematics will give you the proper train of thought to do all those other applications that you can think of, whether it be computer science, whether it be engineering, whether it be physics, whether it be financial analysis. If you have a math major, and I say that from not just from personal experience, because sometimes you shouldn't argue from personal experience because sometimes it doesn't apply, but it really does. In this case, it really does apply, because a math degree, a pure math degree, will give you the necessary intellectual foundation to train yourself in everything else. You see, you can't argue it reverse. You can't say that a physicist, for example, will be a great mathematician. You can't say that a computer scientist, let alone, will be a great pure mathematician. But a pure mathematician can very much train himself to pursue if needed, right? Some of us don't even care, right? But I'm saying, like, from a more practical, even if you wanted a more practical application, you could do, for example, the actuarial exam. And you could do very well on that. I mean, you would have to train in some of the applications, but if you have the pure math foundation, everything else becomes very manageable, including financial analysis. In fact, a lot of banks, at least here in the US, they actually hire directly, and they train. Some banks do. They'll train a pure mathematician. There are many jobs out there that will say, if you have a math degree specifically, we want. The only difference I would say is that you do need, at least like in my case, because I have a pure math degree, they might ask for a software, like you might have to add things like a software skills, software engineering, that they do like. But that's, if that's your goal, that's easily attainable when you have a math degree. So I think everything else flows from that. I think it's the best degree to have, because not only that, and not only in the math fields or the numerical fields, but also, I don't know if a lot of people don't know this, but in the US at least, the highest scores in grammar come from math. Actually, mathematicians score better on the grammar exams on the SAT and on the GMAT than actual humanities majors.
If you saw a person who has a vertical jump of 3 meters, I think there are two possible reactions. One is to become discouraged, which you shouldn't, and one is to become inspired. One time, my friend Jared Casey said to me that there are things that Jesus does and says in the gospel as a proof that he has the perfect answer and that he practices it. But that perfect answer is such that it is obviously unattainable for all of us who are not God incarnate. But we shouldn't be discouraged. We should strive towards perfection.
Right.
And in this sense, I would like to say that what you mentioned about pure mathematics is very analogous. It's not equivalent, but analogous, similar in its proportion to the idea of, yes, I believe that if you are a Christian, you can be good at ethics. If you're good at ethics, it's not clear that you can be a good Christian, because the psychological, practical, and personal challenges that Christianity posits to humanity are not only inescapable, they are beyond attainable. Jesus of Nazareth, the God incarnate as a human person, puts us in such a situation in which you ask yourself, well, how do I deal with that? It's not easy to be a Christian, to make a checklist of ethical rules and say this is right and wrong, and then try to follow them as circumstances permit. It is not the same as the moral and ethical perfection that you will never be able to aspire to attain, but you must pursue.
Yes.
And this is what I like about your work, Mr. Cromwell, the conviction that if you fall, you get up. And it's funny because you denounce this fellow who uses AI. I used Google Translate to do the first translation of the lines, and then I verified with my wife and with dictionaries for the translation that I made of the fundamental principle of law. But you denounce this self-help, new age guru type fellow. He uses apparently AI to very quickly publish books, and how he is not the real deal. The pity and joy, because you know on whose hands your salvation rests, of being a Christian, is knowing you are not the real deal. And that doesn't mean that you shouldn't make an effective effort towards improvement. Can you tell us a little bit about this in closing?
Yes. So even though as fallen human beings, we're never going to be able to attain 100% perfection, right? But through the power of the Holy Spirit, we do attain there's a process called the process of sanctification, right? And as you grow in the Lord, as you grow in Jesus Christ, you become you get closer to God, not God Himself, right? You're not, because we're not, of course, divine, but we do. The closer we get to God, the more we grow in our spirituality, the more perfect in that sense we will become. And we see that manifest itself in the blessings of God, but also in our personal growth. And you see it not just in the blessings that God gives you, but also in your skills as a human being, and the things that you are able to attain and do. Will have, because good habits also breed good financial order. It also breeds good health. So there are consequences to that. Um, so I don't take a fatalistic approach. I take a very proactive approach. And when I denounce people who are, in the case of people who falsely use AI, I'm saying people who use AI without mentioning that they do, right? Because it's misleading. Those people are, not only are they committing a sin, but they are also potentially in some context they can be committing some kind of fraudulent. It's a sort of fraudulent behavior that, in the best case scenario, could even, at least in the U.S., could provoke a lawsuit. Because if there are many situations where if you do not disclose your some of the tools that you've used, the customer can sue you. That's why we have so many disclaimers. So I wouldn't have necessarily a problem with it if someone was upfront about it and said, look, this is the disclaimer. Look, I've used AI. You can buy it. In fact, one of my books, the monograph of algebra, is really a reproduction. I make that very clear. It is a reproduction of a 19th century book that was by Benjamin Greenleaf. And I had that because it was in obscurity and I wanted to bring it back. So to speak. And you can do that because books that are out of print, they're out of copyright. You are allowed to do that, but you have to disclose that. You have to tell your reader, and then the reader can decide. They might say, well, if it's already in circulation, I'm going to buy it from you. Why would I? But that's there. And so I do think that when you are a Christian and when you strive for perfection, the Holy Spirit will help you attain a level of sanctification, a level of perfection that will not only be a blessing to you, but also an example to people around you. Now, works do not save you. In the Christian, at least in the Protestant Reformation, we don't believe that works themselves save you, but works are a manifestation of who you are as a Christian, where you stand with God. And if you are a mature Christian, if you are someone who is growing in the Lord, there are certain behaviors that will be repulsive to you, even if you have a sinful nature. But by the time you grow in Christ, it's almost like when you're in school. By the time you're a senior in school, there are behaviors that you did maybe when you were in 7th, 8th, 9th grade that are just look absurd to you, right? And so when I see the behavior of even some Christians misbehave in reprehensible ways, some of them, I hear Christians, some of them around me, they'll use curse words. And it's not the worst sin in the world, but it is a reflection of, you're not really thinking before you're speaking. You're not really praying to God to help you be more eloquent, to help you speak in a more spiritual way, in a clean way. So I do think that Christians should strive for perfection. Some might call that Puritanism. I just call that being biblical.
I have to say that the question that this raises is about coincidences, historical coincidences. I have to truly believe you when you tell me that mathematicians do better in verbal tests simply because there are certain concepts: identicality, equivalence, proportionality, congruence of a given sophistication that when you see a mathematician read the symbols of mathematics out loud in words, you realize the precision. As a lawyer, you would realize that the precision, where sets are being limited so that there's no ambiguity. and where unions, logical unions, and connections are being made. But here, I have to ask you, what is your opinion in terms of, not again AI and oracles and math sorcerers, but in terms of when it happens, not in a supernatural to our eyes, to our perceptions matter, that someone intends to do sinful, and the coincidences of circumstances against their will and without the participation of any visible human will prevent it.
When you are you referring to individual behavior or more of a collective behavior?
I mean to where the individual overlaps with the collective in the sense that someone wants to do something sinful, rob a grocery
Mhm.
shop, and without the intervention of any human individual or will, circumstances just align in such manner that that person has been prevented from fulfilling their incorrect intention.
So there's a variety of things that intervene in that, right? One of them is, and there are two kinds of people in this, right? You have the Christian person who can fall into sin, and you also have, of course, the non-Christian who doesn't even think about the sinful nature of certain of that behavior. They might think in terms of ethics or moral, perhaps, but in the case of the Christian, sometimes you have the grace of God that intervenes and stops something from occurring because of God's mercy towards his children that would stop something from happening. However, there are other times where even within a saved person, even with someone who is redeemed, um, we will lapse into certain behaviors that are a result of who we were in the past. So I'll give you an example. I always forget her name. If I remember, but she speaks around in the U.S. She is a former lesbian, and she goes around. She said when she was in college, she was into women, and but then she became a Christian, and now she's married to a man, and so her life now is structured. It's a Christian balanced life, but she always mentions the fact that your old nature, whoever you were in the past, in terms of everyone has different sins, but it will come and rear its ugly head sometimes. And that is a process that takes, sometimes you will fall into that, or you will be tempted by your old sinful nature. The Apostle Paul talks about that as well, right? He says, if you were a thief in the past, yes, you can be redeemed. Yes, you might become a person who never steals again, but that old nature is still there in many ways. The smoker is the same way, right? So someone who used to smoke tobacco, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, they might have quit now, but when they see someone smoking a cigarette, they might be tempted. They might remember the old self, right? The old smell. They would say, "Oh, I remember that good smell. I was in a party when that happened." And so you do get. It's really a balancing act because you're always. No human being is ever going to avoid falling into the old sinful nature in some ways. But I think the important thing here is that the more you practice, sort of suppressing that, and I don't mean suppressing it because nowadays people say, oh, if you suppress, it's unhealthy. I mean true suppression, right? But in a healthy way, in a proactive way. If you find ways that you can focus on the grace of God and focus on the things that God wants you to be as a Christian, then I think you don't really have to think as much as going back to your old sinful nature. And I often have that myself. I might remember things that I did when I was in 7th or 8th grade, 9th grade even, that are very sinful. But for me, because I have allowed my life to focus on the mission that God wants me to be, I hardly ever it hardly ever comes to mind. There are other things though that will make you fall, depending on who you surround yourself with as well, right? So even if you're the most practicing Christian, if you're around people who stink of sin, you will fall into their behaviors in some way, even if you yourself might not do the act. There used to be, even I think I learned this in Spain actually, in the old criminal code. There used to be a law in the old criminal code that if you were with a person who was committing, let's say, a bank robbery, even if you were not committing the bank robbery, you were still held criminally responsible. because of the account that you were with that person. So in a way, you didn't stop the person, so you're an accomplice. So if you are surrounding yourself with people who have bad behaviors, you are an accomplice in some ways, especially if you're not there to correct them in what they do, or try to like share the gospel with them.
This is a very hearkening to Reconquista time type of legislation that I was not acquainted with. Now, to finish up, I thank you for your time, for your attention,
Thank you.
for sharing your thoughts with us. But I do have one further question, and that is, to what extent are the goals that we have in this life set by ourselves acceptably of priority? Obviously, there are those who say everything is relative. Yeah, but relative to what? Relative to some fundament, to some basis. But then there are those who avoid it by saying everything is hierarchical. If you have a chain and then you want to skip a link and you put a parallel link somewhere in between, then the chain still holds. And this would seem to lean towards laxity. There was a theologian, Catholic theologian, uh, 20th century Henry de Lubac, who said that traditionally the idea had developed that there is not an issue about the compatibility of the goals that the person sets for himself in this world, as long as they do not interfere with the greater hope of the resurrection and the beatific vision. How do you balance in your own practice your own personal ambitions in the world and the fact that the kingdom is not of this world?
That's a great question. I think you have to always be, and I say, when I say you, I mean universally, people have to be honest with themselves and not be given to surreal fantasies about what their capabilities are. And we're living in a society today where people are told, they're given fake advice. They're being told that, oh, you can become. In fact, this is going around now. People, some individual is saying that you can sing in the shower, and that you can become a great mathematician by just singing in the shower. And that's certainly not the case at all. And so I think in my case, I am aware of what my strengths are, but also what my limitations are, what I cannot do, and what I can't realistically do. And the things that you cannot realistically do, you cannot dwell on those things. For example, I'll give you a very basic example. I have land here now, and I know that realistically, should I cut the grass? Yes. Am I going to do it though? No, because my time commitments, my time constraints simply will not allow. So what do I have to do? I have to spend money on someone who maintains the grounds here. I'm not going to do it myself. But then what I know my strengths are, what I know the things I can do, I know that I can use those goals and those strengths to strengthen the kingdom of God, because I know that that is what God has created me to be. He didn't create me to be an athlete. I'm not an athlete. I could certainly not at my age, and I could never be. Even though, interestingly enough, my genetic report, I did a genetic report only for curiosity, and said you have the genetics of a sprint runner, right? But of course, if you don't practice the sprinting, right, it doesn't matter what the genetics are, right? You're not cultivating those genetics.
Are you in any sense impulsive?
No, I would say that I'm very cautious about because I believe in a rational framework. I don't mean rational in the humanist sense. I mean rational in a logical sense. I'm always very reflective of the decisions that I make. So I would say that one of my, if I could call it a virtue, is to be not impulsive.
Do you think that that is an acknowledgement that because you have the tendencies of a sprinter, you must moderate yourself? One of the things that I used to make a mistake, very stupid mistake, you'll probably laugh at me, but I would solve an equation in algebra after figuring out all the symbols, the order of multiplication and division, the brackets, the parentheses, and then from one line, a 5, I would rush and write a 3 because it looked similar and get the correct wrong answer of the multiple 4 options. So, what brings you to moderation? What inspires your moderation?
My hatred of error. And
That's
so,
it.
well, my hatred of error, and also my idea that if you are too impulsive, right, you also can make very reckless decisions. Sometimes you will make a good decision. I'm not saying always. Sometimes, by virtue of impulse, you can strike, a wrong clock. They say it's twice a day can
But
be correct.
but this is dangerous. This is the reason why you must know the relevant why of things, because you do not want to arrive at the right decision for the wrong reason.
Right, right.
And
And
as you say, a wrong clock, broken clock is right twice a day. You don't want your greatest victory to be the result of such a coincidence.
the faulty thinking, right? And I struggle with that because I think we should always have a foundation, a logical framework to do the things that we do, in whether it be in math, whether it be in financial decisions, whether it be moral decisions as well. We have to be precise. And a lot of people will argue against it. They'll say, no, you can't be precise. Sure, you can. God already tells us what precision means, right? We have definitions of what we mean by precision. It doesn't mean perfection, but it does mean a framework um, for fulfilling the objectives that you have, whether it be in the economy, right? You have to have a clear vision of things, and I think that that's what has helped me personally. Because if you have a clear vision, then you can come with clear goals and also clear ways of getting there, right? It's not just having clear. A lot of people say these are my goals, but then you ask them how are you going to get there, and it makes no sense, right? I've had people come to me in my academy and they say things like they're overly eager, right? So they'll say, oh, if I take 4 years in your academy, I'm going to become a mathematician. No, that's not the way it works. You either have it in you or you don't. Now, what I can tell you is, if you spend 4 years with me, you will never come out the same person, because you will have a proper foundation in the things that you do. But I can't guarantee that you're going to become a mathematician, because I don't know coming in what your strengths are as a human being. And we find that out later on. I've had people graduate, they have 4 years here, they finish the program, and their math improves. Are they a mathematician? No, but their
This
math
is
improves.
this is related to my love of anarcho-capitalism and my love of math. I don't think I would make a great mathematician. I love mathematics. I don't practice it. I love it. And a lot of anarcho-capitalists and a lot of libertarians have this coherentist idea that if you present something that is sufficiently internally coherent as a set of axioms, that there's no such thing as Gödel's incompleteness theorem or Munchausen's trilemma, and that it will be passively absorbed and accepted and embraced by everybody without any marketing and rhetorical understanding of the audience, so that you have to persuade. Whereas the Thomas of Aquinas idea is that something is true to an idea is true to the extent that it overlaps with reality. It is not just that it's internally coherent, like Marxism may be internally coherent, but it does not accord with reality. This is what makes it different from Christianity. And of course, you can point people to the method, you can point people to the truth, but there's also a willful, intentional choice. And also, as you mentioned, the limits every person has in terms of potential.
Right. And also their motives. You could share, let's say, the libertarian philosophy of someone, but if their motives are to control others and to coerce others into doing, to have within a specific framework, you can. I mean, it's the same with the gospel, right? You can share the gospel with someone, and they may accept it, but a lot of people will say, "I'm not interested in what you have to say," and I will. I have these objectives. I want to live my life the way 'cause I hear that a lot around me. I hear students like the rebellious students. They say, "I'm going to live my life the way I want," and I say, "Yeah, you're going to live the life that you want. That's still not going to absolve you from hell." And
This is reminiscent of big atheist Ayn Rand, who had a one-liner: "The interests of rational men do not conflict." Very naive phrase.
right,
But to the extent that that may be possible, there is no more rational man than the Creator himself that has set the laws in motion of the universe that sustains our minds.
correct, and that is what we can aspire as within that theological framework. We can, for example, Christians who share that philosophy will, of course, there will be no major, at least not major conflict, right? But even in that, you get personality clashes, and you get, even within a church, you see that, right? Sometimes you might be in the most biblical church, but if you have a very strong personality, there's going to be some kind of clash, right? Even if your objectives are good, even if you go to a sound doctrinal church, because there's a lot of churches that are not. But you see protagonism, and you even see, you have the women's group, the men's Bible study, then you have pastors, right? Who some pastors have a stronger personality than others. So it affects everyone in many ways.
Mr. Cromwell, I want to thank you so much for your time today. I will ask you to stay for a moment while I download the recording to upload it later. Is there anything else that you would like to tell my audience about City Tutoring, your YouTube channel? What inspired you to start making YouTube videos anyway?
Well, really, it was by coincidence, because I had started after the pandemic. Everybody was isolated and under some restrictions depending on where you were. And I figured, a lot of students told me, they said, "Why don't you do videos?" And I kind of ridiculed it, because I said, "I'm not a YouTuber." Uh, the very thought of YouTube was just alien to me. I knew about YouTube. I like YouTube in many ways if you use it properly, but I just didn't see myself as a YouTuber specifically. But then I started doing videos for my students. It started out very basic. Then I stopped doing it like 4 years ago, and then recently I picked it up again, and I did one on the SAT just for the sake of doing one. And all of a sudden, I noticed it picked up. A lot of people were giving, and I said, "Wait a minute, what's going on here?" And so I made another video. It got me sort of motivated, because I saw that there was some feedback. And then I figured, I already had City Tutoring, which we are dedicated to math, but other subjects too. It's just that I don't teach the other subjects. I have other people doing that. But I figured, why not? And since I was already teaching virtually, all the math courses, everything from algebra all the way to the calculus 1, 2, 3, and 4 levels, and probability, depending on the semester, I figured, why not? And so here we are. And I sort of do it now. I just do it out of habit, depending on office hours, and I'll record a video, perhaps maybe sometimes once or twice a week, but usually either a proper math lesson, or a moral message, a Christian message, or some kind of current events, anything that really, it really depends on what's happening in the world and what God inspires me, after my devotions. Sometimes I usually decide on the same day, God, I pray to God, and then I say, okay, well, this is what I believe God wants me to speak about, and go from there.
I can relate to that. I will hopefully at some point in the future be able to ask you to do a protracted criticism and critique of Khan Academy, but that will be another occasion. Thanks again.
Thank you.